to. And just as my girls don't deserve to suffer in the way that they've had to, Jesus didn't deserve to suffer in the way that he had to either. I deserved it, and you did. I don't understand that kind of love. It is beyond my comprehension, especially as a mother. But I've accepted that love, and it has changed my life. But it never ceases to amaze me. Never. Jeff took the girls home, and as I finished up the details at the hospital, by this time the media is everywhere, and I had to be secretly escorted out of the hospital, and the next hours of my life were a complete blur. The doorbell was ringing, the phone was ringing, the local police were at my house, the FBI, the Illinois State Police were there. And let me just say, I have had to be closely involved with numerous levels of law enforcement, and it has come to my realization that these are some of the finest men and women in our community, and probably some of the most underappreciated professionals among us. And I have just been amazed at how wonderful they have been. It didn't take long for the media to camp outside my house and begin taking pictures, and all of this just contributed to the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare. And if you would have talked to me that day, I would have said something like, "This is crazy." I think that word kept coming out of my mouth. This is just crazy. At 3 o'clock, we heard that CNN was going to have a press conference, and just wanting to get some kind of information, my brothers and I went down to the basement and we watched that press conference. And I remember that a man from the Illinois State Police was leading that press conference, but right next to him was the Maryville Chief of Police, Rich Chardon, and Rich is a friend of ours. And I remember being like, "Oh my goodness, there's Rich on CNN." And it was just the weirdest experience, sitting there like, "Where's Rich on CNN?" And then pretty soon there was pictures of Fred and pictures of the church and then pictures of me and the kids and all of us together. And it was just the most surreal experience. Again, just making it feel like it was just a complete and utter nightmare. And that night, as darkness set in and we began to prepare for bed, it just seemed like any minute Fred was going to walk in through the door. But he didn't. He didn't. And upstairs, the girls and I went to our bedroom. And I just saw one of the most pitiful things I've ever had to watch in my life. They started rooting through our dirty clothes hamper, looking for things that smelled like Fred. And I thought, is this what we've been reduced to? Is this the best we have now? Dirty clothes? And we snuggled up in our bed together, and they just cried. And as a mom, you're supposed to know how to fix stuff, make things better, and I didn't. And they were so sad, and they were so afraid. They were so afraid. Every single little noise brought utter fear to their hearts. And my heart was aching in a way that I never imagined that it would. And we snuggled for a little while. And I felt God move. I remembered that about 3 days before this, I had purchased the book called 90 Minutes in Heaven by Don Piper. This was a book that Fred had read 2 years ago. Not that it would have normally been a book that he would have read, but somebody here, I don't know who, had urged him to read this book. And so he did. And he would read the book, and he would tell me about it. And in such great detail, he would tell me about it that I joked with him and said, "I'm not even going to have to read this book because you're telling me everything in it." About the 3rd or 4th day into it, I looked at him and I said, "This book is really getting to you, isn't it?" And he shook his head, and tears came down his face. Well, after he got done reading it, he decided that he wanted all of you here to experience the story of Don Piper. So he went and contacted Don Piper, saying, "I want him to come and share his story at First Baptist Maryville." So I went down, I found that book. The girls and I, we read chapters 2 and 3 that night, which is Don Piper's account of being in heaven. And it talks about how when you get to heaven, you meet people at the gate there that you knew here on earth. And I think Cassidy joked and said, "Well, Dad's homecoming there is probably still going on because he knew everybody." And we joked about that and thought, yeah, it probably is. Yeah. It's like a big family reunion. I thought, how happy. He loved everybody. He loved talking to and meeting everybody. I thought, how happy that would have been for him to meet and to be there with so many people at the gate of heaven. I think about former church members that have went on and that, he missed. And there he was, meeting them, seeing them again. And then it talked about in the music in heaven, how everything blends in there so harmoniously and people sing, and it's just this beautiful, beautiful music in heaven. And a lot of you know that Fred was a horrible singer. Right? I always tell people, think of the worst singer that you know. Well, Fred sang worse than the person you're thinking of right now. Right? I remember when Alyssa was about 4 years old enough to know that her dad could not sing. She looked up at him one time with her little chubby cheeks and she said, "Daddy, one day I'm going to teach you how to sing like a beautiful woman." She never quite got that accomplished, but anyway. And we joked about how he could sing. Yay! He could finally sing. And it just was a fun time for us to think about what he was experiencing. It was the first time that day that I felt really any sense of peace and comfort. And I learned a really important lesson that moment. That sometimes our focus becomes so set on our circumstances right here and now. That there is something that's real, more real than here and now, and it's called heaven. It's called eternity. And focusing on heaven doesn't take away our pain for the here and now, but it sure does put things in proper perspective. It sure does. You know what? God was in my bedroom that night, providing us with a sense of peace. And I really believe that God was right next to Fred that day and took him home to heaven. Well, March 8th had come to an end that day, and it was the first night of being a widow and the first night of my daughters not having a father. And I realized several things very quickly in the days that followed March 8th. That first of all, that life can end for any of us without warning. None of us are guaranteed tomorrow or even the rest of today. And no matter how long of a life we are blessed to live, each of us will one day die and have to face our eternal destination. I also became vividly aware that our circumstances in life can change drastically and without any kind of warning. No matter how badly I wanted to get out of the nightmare I was in on March 8th, I couldn't. I had to face it head on. I was suddenly a widow. My children were fatherless, and our church and community were shattered by murder. But even though my circumstances changed, the God that I know did not change. And in my profound darkness, I still felt his goodness and his love, and I saw his faithfulness. I went to the pit. God was in that pit. He was right there in that pit with me. There is hope in chaos. There is peace in the middle of the storm, and there is joy in spite of our circumstances. You see, I was always taught this, and I did believe it. I did. But now I know it. I do. And I had had trials in my life before that had questioned my faith, but I'm just going to be honest with you, none of them compared to the murder of my husband and what I've had to endure since then. So when my life storm came and it was my tragedy that made the headlines, I had to determine one thing: was knowing Jesus enough? It is. It is. The strength that I draw on doesn't come from religion. It doesn't come from believing a set of facts about God. It doesn't come from doing good things. It comes simply from having an intimate, trusting relationship with God's Son, Jesus Christ. That's what faith is. It's trust. It's trusting him when life doesn't seem fair, when nothing's going right. It's trusting him when your world is seemingly falling apart. When I was a 9-year-old little girl, I realized that I had sins in my life that separated me from knowing God in a relational way. And I also realized it was because of these sins I wouldn't spend eternity with Jesus in heaven. I realized that Jesus died on the cross to take away my sins so that he could have a relationship with me. And I wanted